So the first thing we're going to do is have everyone intro themselves. So Trevor, why don't we get started with you?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm Trevor. I'm an engineering director at Drift. Spent most of my career kind of working at everything from seed to growth stage startups. Previously at HubSpot, and I've spent a lot of time kind of straddling the line between DevOps and product teams, so a little bit on kind of both sides of the fence.
Amazing. All right, Melissa.
Hare. So my name's Melissa Whitehead. I am with Kensho. I'm the CTO of Kensho and been in that role for about a year now, but I've been with Kensho for 5 years. I've been with Kensho from pre-acquisition to post-acquisition, so we're an innovation hub of S&P Global. Prior to that, I was at FactSet Research Systems for about 7 years, and then some other jobs here and there. But I've kind of straddled the line between being an independent software engineer and then a leader, and now I'm CTO at Kensho.
Amazing. Ali?
Hi, everybody. My name is Ali. I'm the director of engineering for a company called ConnectRN. So ConnectRN is a platform that lets nurses find job opportunities with both hospitals and long-term care facilities. So our work has always been important, but it's been particularly important over the past 2 years with both the shortage and high stress levels in the nursing community. I've been in the industry for roughly 20 years or so, working for a dozen or so companies, including a couple of my own consulting companies, in all roles. Sort of what Melissa said, a lot of individual contributor type roles, and then over the last 10 years or so, more and more technical management. And topics like these are quite near and dear to my heart, so I'm very excited to be part of this panel and have this discussion.
Amazing. Brian?
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Fallick. I'm the Vice President of Engineering at Xandr. I came to Xandr by way of acquisition, originally part of the startup Clipped that was in the ad tech space in the Boston area. Sort of my background is serial startup as an individual contributor and then as a manager and leader. And I have a lot of experience on both sides of that and love talking about software development process. I'm really looking forward to this panel.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we have a really stacked panel today, so I'm going to hop right into the first question. So, when we're talking about balancing any two things, whether that's speed and quality or something else, I think we need to have like a sense of what those two things are and how to kind of measure them in a certain sense. So maybe we can get some definitions of speed and quality, whether quantitative or qualitative. So Melissa, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, just finding the unmute button there. So speed, definitely, right? In this context, we're talking about delivery time, right? Not the response time of an application or compute time. But when it comes to delivery, speed alone isn't really a terribly useful measure, right? What you're looking for is velocity, right? Getting to the desired outcome quickly, right? If your team ends up building a mansion and ultimately the thing that you should have built was an apartment complex, right? That's a problem. You might have done that quickly. So I think focusing on the outcome is the important takeaway here. Quality for me, and I thought hard about this, is about predictability. So, the predictability of a software system, like to hit whatever metrics matter, right, to you or to the company, and things that make software predictable, right? It functions as advertised to both your friendly users and your chaotic users. More than one engineer understands the code base, and the code isn't surprising to your future self.
Yeah, that's a tough one, that last one especially. Hey, Ali, do you want to pick up the conversation there and maybe add a little more?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm going to get just a little bit meta on the group here. And, I would say as technical leaders, I think we often have some sense of what speed is and what quality is. But I would say a lot of times that's subjective. I would say each organization really needs to define what is fast enough and what is good enough. A lot of times it's product and industry dependent, right? The needs of a social media company or a gaming company versus a banking company or a medical company or a security company, right? You're going to have slightly different levels, right? So I think in one of our LinkedIn marketing piece, there was the thing about Facebook saying move fast and break things. that's great. But right, Facebook is a non-essential social media product, right? They can move fast and break things versus something that is a lot more mission critical, right? It may not be appropriate. So I would say that's a good conversation, I think, to have formally with your team, and that's something I have not had actually during thinking of this and during talking through this with folks like Brian and others. I think it might be a good idea to really formally have the exercise of really sitting down with the stakeholders in your team and say what is our definition, because whether it's your investors, your customers, your sales team, your customer service team, your product, your engineering, I think they're going to have a different sense of what that is. And I think the sooner you can have some sort of a consensus on that, I think the sooner you're going to be able to move forward with those definitions. So.
Yeah, that's totally true. I think it's unique on a company-to-company basis. And at a younger stage startup, you might need your definition of speed might be how many product features you're able to get out to try and iterate towards product market fit. Whereas at a larger company, you probably already achieved that. So your speed metrics are going to be quite different. Brian or Trevor, do you guys want to add sort of your thoughts here?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I got to agree with what's already been said. I noted, when you introduced this topic, you talked about the definition being either qualitative or quantitative. And I feel pretty strongly that certainly in the startup space, that really needs the conversation needs to begin qualitatively. It really needs to be, and it really needs to be a conversation, right? It's not a monologue that engineering can dictate how fast are we going or are we meeting the quality bar. It really needs to be amongst all the stakeholders, which Ali referred to, but it needs to be the beginning of a process where there's some amount of measurement taken and it's iterated over time, evaluated and iterated. Because to me, part of the interesting things about startups are bringing new groups of developers together, new teams together to build new things. And part of that is you need a new measuring stick. And so you've got to get that started early, and you want to kind of evaluate that over time. And that's the way you can improve your speed and quality and balance those two sometimes conflicting directions.
Sorry, Trevor, please.
I was just going to echo everything that you guys have said so far. Maybe adding on a couple new points. I think Drift is a marketing tech stack. So I 100% agree with everything you're saying. That it's going to be different for every company, and that's an important conversation to have about what is important for your customers. For us, we have a very incremental approach. It's almost very experimental. We need to be able to release software in order to be able to learn things from that software. So for us, that cycle time is really important, and so the ability to get software into production quickly is kind of essential to that learning process. A really good analogy that I once heard is that if you really want to have a fast car, you need to have really good brakes. And so I think for us, kind of that rollback and observability is also a really important aspect of that speed. So you need to get stuff out of production as quickly as you can put it in.
Right. Ali, you had a follow-up point there?
I was just going to say it's worth mentioning, right? The more I've been thinking about this actively in this context, the more this comes back to support and alignment in your leadership team. And I think if it comes from the top, it actually makes that definition and then following through with the implications of the definition much better, right? And if the often in a startup company, often the founders or the leadership may not be technical, which I've worked with many founders that are not technical, right? So they may have a finance background or marketing background or something else, right? So in that case, I think it really is incumbent on the engineering leaders to really get them familiar with these concepts and tell them why it's important, because A, you'll be helping everybody, and B, I think you'll have a much happier engineering team.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to suggest that, back to the earlier idea that, in this startup phase, you're bringing new people together, new teams, building new products. Part of that conversation that I think Ali is referencing with, the CEO, the founders, what have you, is starting to educate and evaluate what trade-offs are acceptable to the business. And I think that's kind of very nuanced based on the players, based on the industry, and based on the near-term goals of the startup. It might be, hey, we need a prototype out in market now, or it might be, we need to solidify our platform because, we're really focused on scale, and so we have a slightly longer-term view. So I think, getting that conversation early and starting to kind of get nuanced about what trade-offs mean and what trade-offs are acceptable is really important for the early stages of a startup.
Right. Yeah. And I think this all kind of comes full circle to the earlier point about, deciding what that means for your particular company, and having those conversations where at Drift, it might be cycle time is the speed metric, and how quickly you can get something out versus pull it back is how fast you're going, and how many times you're able to do that maybe on a per day or per week basis is how you're measuring that. But yeah, okay, that's a really great starting point. So we kind of have some notion of, okay, what does speed mean at different companies and in quality as well. And there's also kind of this open-ended aspect of it where it definitely depends on the scale, the size of your company, and the needs of your company as well. But let's move on to the next question based on that, which is, are these two things mutually exclusive? So speed and quality, do you have to pay for one with the currency of the other? Or are there ways that you can kind of shortcut and basically get both? Can you hack it and get both, be faster and have higher quality standards at the same time? So Brian, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. I think my answer follows along from some of the comments I made earlier, which is that, I think at a very high level, these two concepts appear sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum, kind of like trade, you can exchange one for the other. I think the reality is when you dig down and look at the nuances and understand sort of what's being asked, there are vast opportunities to deliver on both. And you really can make a lot of headway without sacrificing one or the other. And I truly believe that. I think that when you get the right people in the right conversation to really dig in deep and understand what those trade-offs are, you can deliver on both.
Right. Yeah. Trevor, do you want to maybe follow up there?
Sure. Yeah, 100% agree with that. I think they're actually incredibly aligned in most cases. There's an incredible book, Accelerate. If you haven't read it, it's all about this topic, and they kind of set out to prove kind of scientifically that those two concepts are actually very aligned, and that if you want to be able to have good quality software, it's actually almost a prerequisite to be able to iterate on your system more quickly. So for us, at least, I believe that those are very aligned goals in most cases.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely one of those DevOps principles, I think, that is in all of those those books where they're saying that the faster you're able to iterate, the quicker you're able to release. It's indicative of these higher quality standards, actually, in a lot of companies and quicker delivery times. Melissa or Ali, I don't know if you guys had any more thoughts on the exclusivity of these things.
I did actually, just hearing folks speak. I think there's also, there's kind of a process that you can bake in as well that helps the kind of flywheel there, which is because there is a broad spectrum between sloppy and over-engineered, right? I mean, that there is, you can put out a prototype in a way that is quality quickly, but then I think one of the kind of practical tools that folks can use that can leverage to do that is code review. I mean, code review really helps build that muscle, and just practice. And the more that you participate either as a reviewer or a reviewee, you'll start producing more quality quicker. Right.
I mean, just follow up there. Are there particular code review practices at Kensho or otherwise that have helped you guys maintain high quality and speed at the same time? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, actually something that that Mikey, who I know was on a panel yesterday, helped kind of put into place was this notion of putting the onus on the reviewee to ask a reviewer what kind of level of review is required so that the reviewer can then kind of budget their time to say, okay, this is kind of a level 1 review, and we define what level 1 means, or level 2 review. So, okay, this is something that's, what we call a one-liner, or something that is, pretty benign, versus something that might need a little bit, maybe needs a couple pairs of eyes, Maybe there's something that's a business logic change, really like semantically a big change. So it's
Right.
kind of categorizing things so that the reviewers can quickly pick up on how much time they have to budget for a code review.
Interesting. Yeah, and so that can probably help accelerate some of these smaller changes to get out faster while maintaining the high quality on the bigger changes that are higher risk.
Exactly. And smaller bite-sized changes more frequently, which we can get into later, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to say that, Melissa. I think one thing, and Brian perhaps was going to echo the same thing, is avoiding these massive PRs that are A, difficult to review, and B, first of all, people are intimidated to even approach them. Secondly, once you start the review process, they're a massive PR. So breaking those down further, assigning specific engineers to a particular PR has helped as well with that specific thing.
What do you mean when you say assigning specific engineers to a particular PR?
Yeah, so basically, right, there are two ways you can actually throw a PR out. You either throw it out to your whole group, or if you know there's a particular engineer who's better suited to review this PR, somebody who's more familiar with this piece of code, or somebody you've been working with, where you're explicitly soliciting feedback from them. That has helped on specific PRs to move those along and to get a higher quality of feedback.
Gotcha. And sorry, just for the audience, just in case we have some folks who are a little bit less technical, a pull request is when you ask to basically merge a change that you've made into the main code base. And so sometimes these PRs can be giant. But what we're talking about here is really kind of narrowing the scope of any particular change, so it's very small, bite-sized, understandable, and so people can quickly kind of look at this and understand whether it's going to break something potentially fast. So just wanted to throw that out there for any non-technical folks.
The other thing I was gonna make a couple more thoughts on the speed and quality being mutually exclusive. Again, I think the more I've thought about this, this is sort of one of two themes, right? The first one being really great alignment and agreement from the top down, from your management. I think the other theme that keeps coming up as I think through this is just better tooling and processes. So improving quality intuitively means our code quality, right? Again, that is still a little ambiguous, but it essentially means code quality. And I think the way you get better code quality is through better tooling and processes. And so improving speed, right, typically means releasing features to production faster. And I would say, again, the best way to do that is speeding up your processes and getting that feedback faster, right? So there are specific things like QA automation and automated builds and unit test coverage that allows those automated builds and easy deployments. I think if you have a lot of those, or at least some of those in place, I think improving the quality of your tools and processes improves the speed. You get faster feedback, and improving your speed, meaning getting faster feedback, improves the quality because you can iterate faster and therefore make more improvements quicker.
Right. Per unit time.
Right. A lot of it goes to basically like increasing the level of your confidence for a given release and decreasing the level of risk. And all these tools, I feel, do their part in accomplishing that. So you can actually have the whole cycle be much faster overall.
One thing I wanted to say is I really appreciated Melissa's suggestion on the different level of code reviews. I think that's quite a valuable suggestion. And to sort of tie that to Ali's point, one trick, if you will, or capability that's really nice is to have your CI/CD system automatically chew on PRs and provide feedback even before someone reviews it. And that way you're not wasting the team's time by saying like, oh, this won't even build. Why am I reviewing it? Or this isn't legal code. Like I'm not, this isn't, it's not ready for me to start, spending time understanding. So the combination of automation and then kind of building that into your PR process can also help with simplifying the flow.
Yep, could not agree more.
Totally double down on that comment about automation. I think like in the kind of hierarchy of effectiveness, like documentation, any human process is always going to be somewhat unreliable inherently, and the more you can automate in that process, whether it's checks during the build process, unit testing, integration testing in your staging environment, even things after you've deployed, those are going to always accelerate kind of that flywheel and and helping you kind of get better code to production faster. To Ali's point, you really want to be increasing that confidence in your system at all times.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Automation is such a crucial piece of making sure that you can run your tests quickly and make sure that everything is up to spec for your build. You're not breaking anything. There's no reversals in functionality. Maybe to take like a little bit of a side path and then come back to some of the conversations we're having here. Trevor, you mentioned documentation and kind of some of the unreliability. I've run into this a lot. At a young startup, there's almost none. Sometimes you're lucky if you have a decent piece of documentation. Even at the larger startups, that kind of early stage documentation setup carries over, and so the documentation infrastructure is not necessarily up to spec. How much value does documentation really have for like a software company? Are there ways that you can make it higher value, or is it just something that is going to be unreliable and kind of fall out of pace with the real reality of things?
It's a really good question. I don't know if I've got like the best answer on documentation.
Sure, yeah.
I think that a lot of documentation that exists within organizations is documentation about processes, and to the extent that you can automate those processes, that's almost always preferable, especially in an early stage. But there's absolutely value in good readmes on your repos and things like that, so that a new engineer coming on board can quickly gather context about the system. Documentation is not the only way to do that, though. There's other tools that can help automate that for sure.
Right. I really like that, like documentation more for the processes. And if you can even automate those, then please try to do that. But that way things are always in sync with reality as opposed to potentially falling out of sync.
I'll add on to Trevor's comment as well, which is, as close as you can get the documentation to the code, the better, right? So in READMEs and things like that, where you're likely to change the documentation if you're changing the code rather than off in some document somewhere, right? So where possible, as close to the code as possible.
I think that's a very astute comment, Melissa. I was going to say the same thing. Whether it's near the code or I would say documentation in context, right? Whether it's documentation that's part of, let's say, a Jira ticket, or a documentation that's part of your code base, or a documentation that's in a separate wiki. I think if it's in context, and as I think you put it best, close to the code, I think it's useful. And the other responsibility that comes with documentation, obviously, is the responsibility of keeping it up to date. I think what's worse than having documentation is really like super outdated documentation that just confuses everybody. So that's just a big challenge with, you see that most with large comment blocks within code bases where the code gets updated and the comments get left behind. That's one example, but like that's the other sort of the hygiene, like process hygiene part that people forget about.
I would suggest. Oh, sorry, I was just going to jump in real quick. I would suggest that, especially at the startup phase, it's pretty important to establish a culture of keeping documentation up to date, and also a culture of culling it when it's woefully out of date and providing more confusion than clarity. That's okay too. But I think that it is an investment that needs to be sort of established at the start, and it needs to kind of be part of the culture of like, hey, you know what, I am going to go clean up those docs because I just redesigned this module and they're not accurate anymore. Yeah,
that is definitely true. Sometimes it's so easy to be like, oh, I'm done with my PR. Okay, let's move on to the next thing. Whereas like, okay, there's a lot of meta things that need to maybe happen around that. And sometimes it's easy to forget about that when you're on to the next thing, on to the next feature and getting out more product value for people. Okay, so with that little side kind of pathway, let's come back to the main road, which the next question is, what is your definition of tech debt? This is such a nebulous term. Everyone throws it out there, one of those crazy good buzzwords to throw out. But is it real? Like, what does it really mean for you? And maybe this is another one of those cases where it's unique to your company potentially. But I think that there is probably a through line for a lot of folks. How do you manage tech debt, Trevor?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have the best answer for this one either. I think tech debt is kind of one of those black hole words where everyone has their own definition. I think most folks, especially early in their career, see tech debt as basically anything that they didn't write yesterday. And so it's really hard to establish like what tech debt really is. I think one of the more effective things that we've tried to do is measure things. And this kind of goes back to quality of, like, what is pain? Pain is like pages, bugs, support tickets, things that are actually impacting your ability to deliver value to customers, and like look for tech debt in those things or opportunities to improve those things, as opposed to just looking for things that you kind of want to refactor because they're difficult to work in right now. Is that actually causing pain for you or the customer? That's an important question to ask.
Okay, so sorry, I think there was a brief cutoff there, but I don't know what happened. But so sorry, just to repeat, so you were saying kind of pain points, like anything like bugs, support tickets, things that are like cropping up and kind of sucking away time. You could classify that sort of as tech debt, and that's kind of how you guys do it at Drift.
Yeah, rather than looking for tech debt in the code in terms of repos that need to be updated or something like that, look for the sources of pain that are actually causing problems for your customer.
I couldn't agree more with how Trevor positioned that. It's funny. I actually, like 2 weeks ago, I gave a presentation at Xander about tech debt to the whole company, which is kind of interesting. But my thesis in that presentation, and in general, is that everything we produce, everything we build, has some level of tech debt to it. And so, to Trevor's point, I think the important part is to have a process to prioritize that and work through it so that the highest pain, kind of lowest hanging fruit get addressed quickly, and some of the other tech debt that maybe isn't as painful but is lingering can be postponed and delayed, and that also affords opportunities to kind of not try to get it all done, and so you can deliver on important features to keep the business going.
All right. Reed,
Melissa, go ahead.
I want to take a stab at actually trying to define it. So I bear with me because I try to define it. All right.
Okay, let's do this.
That is something that is owed, right? And we don't talk about this. So I define it as technical work that is owed to a project as a result of making a specific choice that is understood to be an inferior choice for the situation. So it's a conscious choice to do something. So that's my attempt. And I think the way, and I think you can categorize it, and this is why it becomes nebulous, right? Because there's a technical choice. There's also organizational choices, right? So a choice to move somebody off of a project when they're the sole owner of a project to a different project, you're accruing debt automatically by making that choice, because now there's a project that's unmaintained, right? So it's not a well-oiled machine anymore by doing that. So that could be considered technical debt. But I think, in terms of technical choices that were made that kind of pile on, I'll speak to that a little bit. So of how we can manage that, right? Because I think sometimes we have this tendency to throw everything that doesn't comprise feature work into a technical debt pile, and then we want to like build this fence around that pile, and then we expect like product and business folks to kind of empathize or trust that it's important for us to resolve this everything that's in this fence. And I think if for nothing else, to keep ourselves accountable for where our time is being spent, that we need to translate what paying down this tech debt is into a desirable outcome, right? For more than just ourselves. And I think this speaks to what Trevor was saying with pain points, right? It's painful to you, but so let's get a simple example of, you're an engineer who is doing business critical, disruptive rote work that could be automated, right? So obviously investing in fixing and automating that work helps you, the individual, because it's painful for you to have a better quality of life, but it helps everybody else. Why? Because you've increased exposure to a business critical process, right? And you freed yourself up to work on features that might be in backlogs. So I think that's being specific about what it is that you're paying down, I think is the key when we talk about technical debt.
Yeah, and that point of like we fence off this like Epic in Jira and it's like tech debt, and then you just like add a bunch of tickets to it, and that point of hoping that business and product are going to empathize is true, because they do have to prioritize all of that against all the other feature work and adding customer value, which in an indirect way this, or maybe even direct way, this might do, but you have to convince them of that and make sure that business case is illuminated for them.
Yeah, it goes back to what Brian was talking about earlier with just having those trade-off conversations, right? That's part of the conversation that you have with your stakeholders, right?
Right, absolutely. Ali?
How did you know I had an Epic in Jira with tech debt title read?
Because I have an Epic in Jira.
Yeah, I will totally echo everything the panel said so far. I think it absolutely is real. I mean, every code base has some level of it, or high levels of it. And I also define it essentially how Melissa said it, right? It's really cutting corners during your development to save time in the short term. And then you continue to build more and more features on top of that potentially weak foundation, right? So it really comes down to, I think, short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. And a lot of times this is a negotiation that happens either between management and an engineering team, or let's say a product and an engineering team, where the conversation may go like, it's okay, just do it this way because it'll get it out quicker and we'll actually look at it later. And the look at it later part rarely happens. And before you know it, you've done this over 6 months, a year, 2 years. And now you have, this shaky foundation. And I think the tech debt, when not addressed, it can become fairly insidious, because this effect compounds as you start to build more, and your velocity and your productivity just keeps going down and down and down, which could create a lot of frustration from the engineering team. It could be a cause of burnout. It can strain relationships between business, product, and engineering. And in the longer term, even the medium term, costs the business money in terms of productivity, because your engineering team has higher and higher levels of frustrations on why can't I actually extend a feature, or why can't I build something on top of this? Well, because of the potentially poor choices that we have made knowingly or unknowingly in the past.
Right. Absolutely. Like hard coding. Oh, if it's this client, don't do this. But if it's that client, then do that. There's a lot of that that can potentially really screw you in the long run. But maybe in that moment, it's just like, oh, I don't want to build a whole configuration system. Let me just hard code our clients. But yeah, those kind of decisions can really add a ton of complexity to your code. And that's just one example I've definitely run into before.
Brian, you were gonna.
Yeah, I love this discussion. This is great. I think the one piece that I'll sort of challenge, or at least suggest that I have maybe a slightly different take on tech debt, is I truly don't think of it as a shortcoming. I don't think of it as necessarily a decision that was forced, or that engineers were forced to make, that might have been different in another scenario, or with more time, or with more resources. I actually think of it broader as just a natural aspect of everything we build. And an example of where that plays out is, you might choose the best programming language, the best library, the best everything to build some feature. And that's great. And you might, these dependencies, these upstream dependencies might be the best, at that time. As time goes on, new releases come out, new bug fixes are incorporated into those dependencies, new APIs are released. And so suddenly your best choice 1 year ago now has accumulated some tech debt. So my take is that it's a little broader. It's not just kind of a shortcoming. It's really just a fundamental attribute of everything we build. And I totally agree with everything else that was said in terms of how it needs to be addressed and prioritized and sort of all those aspects. But I sort of go a little bit farther, I think, in thinking about it as broader than just kind of a shortcoming that an engineer might have made.
Right. Yeah.
I like that. I like that Zen approach, Brian. It's be one with the tech debt.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, that kind of comes back to your point of like, everything comes with a little bit of tech debt, or maybe a lot of tech debt, but it's just a reality that we kind of have to deal with and manage in different ways. Okay, so to kind of continue the conversation, we had talked earlier about how releases and deployments and cycle times can be one kind of metric around how quickly a company's working towards some end. So I'm curious, how many times does your company release to per day, and how many times is kind of ideal, maybe on a general basis, or in different instances? Maybe for some companies it's a little bit less, maybe for some companies is more. But is there a band that people should be striving for? Trevor, do you want to go on this one?
Sure. Yeah. So we deploy to production about, give or take, 1,500 times a month. If you do the math, it works out to be about once per engineer per day. And I think that's actually been a really good benchmark for us. It ensures that we're putting the necessary automation in place to maintain high confidence around the code that we're shipping. We're breaking down work into small enough units that they're easy to test, they're easy to code review, things like that. and we're not stacking up too many of those changes all at once, so we can kind of roll them into production independently. Now, the one big caveat I would put around that is that we don't necessarily ungate every single thing that we put into production immediately for all of our customers. And I think especially as you move to other types of businesses in the healthcare industry or things like that, like progressively releasing things to broader and broader groups of customers becomes incredibly important, and having kind of that staged release process, even just for enterprise companies if you're moving up market. So just because we deploy that much doesn't necessarily mean that everything immediately gets in every single customer's hands. It helps mitigate the impact of something potentially going wrong.
I have a follow-up. Trevor, I have a quick follow-up for you. I'm really curious about what is the specific nature of these releases. I know you use things like gates or feature flags to not necessarily have the visibility on for everybody, but are these often, when there is not a feature flag on it, are these often user-facing features or features that could actually affect the functionality or the flow of a live product right now?
Yeah, in almost every single case, yes. Sometimes they might be a backend change, sometimes they might be a UI change, sometimes they might be a bug fix. Most of them are some sort of user-facing change. They're not necessarily things that every single customer would notice.
Right. Well, how do you balance like the really high frequency of your releases with like mitigating any confusion that a customer may have, or messaging to them that, hey, this is changing? And is the nature of your product such that where that is not as important as something else?
100%. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. As we've moved up market as a business, that's become an increasingly important conversation, and what types of changes can kind of immediately go out because they're more behind the scenes, or things that we would like to package up for our product marketing team to do kind of a monthly release around and can control that message, has become increasingly important. But especially at the early stage, like getting things out the door was probably much more important than being able to put it in our newsletter ahead of time.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, we release once every 2 weeks at the moment, right? So we have a 2-week sprint, and we release at the end of that. We are contemplating going to continuous delivery, but again, it's that question. Continuous delivery is great, but it may or may not make sense for your company,
right,
or your team. And so that's really been my main challenge, is what I was asking Trevor. It's that ability to effectively message, right, and not surprise your customers with a different UI or a different workflow. And I think feature flags is certainly one way to mitigate that. I'm really interested to hear from others on what else could help with that.
Yeah. Right before we continue this part of the conversation, I just want to throw a quick, we're about 20 minutes out, so maybe in like 5 to 10 minutes, we'll probably go to an audience Q&A. So I'd love to see more questions in the Q&A section. So this is just a reminder for folks to throw in questions in the Q&A. We will be doing a Q&A session. So, but yeah, in terms of tools and technologies, I think that's a great segue. We have a question here that says, what kinds of tools and technologies can a company leverage to increase velocity? So I think this fits kind of perfectly into that cycle time where feature flags may be one of those tools. Are there others, and how can you leverage feature flags to kind of accelerate?
I can take this one and advocate.
Yeah.
It's a lot of kind of choices and paradigms, and less so like technologies, but yeah, I'll walk through a couple of things. So I think you mentioned like investing in configuration, software, like, oh man. However, I think, infrastructure as code, configuration as code, right? To increase the visibility into how a system is set up, right? Because that kind of curtails the use of like magicians that know how to run some things in the background, and they're the only people that know. So like we do that quite a bit. Our whole production system is built with infrastructure as code, which is fantastic, right? So so having that paradigm, I think, is a great way to increase velocity. We mentioned code coverage tooling for sure, policy checking, security, vulnerability scanning, all baked into your pipeline. And then you can decide as a company whether or not you want to actually gate and block on that, or you just want to surface awareness to the folks that are submitting those PRs, as we mentioned earlier. You can decide, but surfacing that as part of the process automatically is super helpful. And another kind of in the choices bucket, I think, again, depending on the stage, fewer technologies, right? So don't allow every technology under the sun, because then it makes it easier to establish a collective understanding of best practices, ensure that a greater breadth of people can code review, at least from the structure of code and understandability, kind of readability standpoint, maybe not so much business logic wise. So for like an early stage company, I wouldn't recommend, highly fractured applications or microservices or anything like that. But on the larger organization, you might be able to sustain having a team around, technologies in a certain stack, for instance. Yeah. So I'd less, on specific tools, but more about paradigms there. But we can certainly get into specific tools, especially for the CI/CD pipeline stuff. I'm sure you guys have some suggestions too.
Yeah, Trevor.
Yeah, I mean, maybe playing on the same notion of paradigm more than a specific technology, but with a specific technology in this case. We have obviously invested very heavily in our deploy system, but it's all managed entirely through Slack. And I think making that all chat ops has actually been incredibly powerful. Any single engineer can just type /deploy the name of their service and kind of manage the deploy rollback process entirely through that screen. It centralizes it into a singular place so everyone can see what's going on. But making those processes as easy as possible to access, to the point that Melissa made, you don't want to have to rely on somebody running out of SHR commands or messing with the AWS console. Those things get very, very complicated. So if you can centralize that in a tool that everybody already uses, like Slack, it can be super powerful.
Right. Yeah. And I know at Blend, they've centralized things into GitHub Enterprise. So using GitHub as sort of that central tool. But yeah, exact same kind of paradigm, using a tool everyone already uses to go ahead and deploy and do various kind of like commands.
To answer that specific question, Reed, about specific tools and processes, I'll echo what everybody said, and I also have quite a list actually of processes and tools that you could use, and I'll give at least 50%, if not more, credit to Brian, with whom I had a fantastic conversation right about this. I'm happy to quickly go down some of these. Some of these we talked about before, right? Sort of, what is your definition of speed and quality? Ability to measure speed and quality, right? A mature design and requirements gathering process. A reliable way of tracking your work progress. Good logging is something that we're really pushing for at the moment. I think performance metrics about your product. Melissa, I added yours to the list, Melissa, of infrastructure as code. We also employ that. We need to employ that, I think, to a greater degree. A/B testing tools are high on my list. Feature flags we already talked about, and then some of the other things we talked about, such as QA automation. There's a huge focus right now on QA automation on our side, because it just makes your iterations faster. Automated builds and unit tests. And I think two things that they don't really fall neatly into this category, but like making sure that your engineering team isn't always super interrupted driven. Do they have enough long chunks of time for coding and collaboration? And are you being selective about meetings? And that's something that's a personal challenge of mine right now, especially in the era of COVID and Zoom. All of those tendencies sort of become exacerbated, and now a person is only a Zoom call away, and it could be between Zoom and Slack. Unless you're disciplined, it can become very disruptive. And I think that goes at the very heart of how much focus does a team have to actually put out good work. So
right, focus time for sure. On that note about testing automation, what role do you guys think testing plays in maintaining a high quality system? Is testing fundamental? Is it something that you should be doing at every level, no matter what the size of your company is? Or what kind of like leeway is there? Should you be testing unit integration all the way up like the pyramid, so to speak? Or what is kind of the most like bang for your buck on the testing side?
I'll jump in on this one because I feel like I have a fairly strong opinion, which is that, I think that testing is paramount, but I think that, to your point, where do you get the most bang for your buck is really the question to ask throughout the entire life cycle. Because you can sort of read a blog post that says, oh, you need foobar testing, and so go out and build a big foobar tester, and then you realize that they didn't catch any bugs, and that was not really a good use of your time. So I feel like the question to ask is, what is it you're trying to catch? Like what is the quality that you're trying to sort of address, and then what is the best bang for your buck? And that journey is relatively well defined. I would imagine that most, the first stop for most teams is unit testing, just because most modern languages have that built in and it's easily accessible. It's the kind of thing you started with. And so that tends to be the first choice, but by no means is that sufficient. That it tends to grow over time based on the needs of the company, the needs of the business. But I would basically say my thesis on that topic is really just, where are the problems, and then what is the right infrastructure to help us sort of avoid those. It might be fuzz testing, it might be integration testing, or using some sophisticated container technology to sort of orchestrate a number of systems together. It might be more extensive unit testing. It really depends on the situation.
Right. Yeah. I really like the fact that the answer included, it depends on kind of the problems that exist within your company. Like maybe you guys are having more problems at the individual function level, and like you're cropping up these individual inputs and outputs, and sometimes it gets skewed in the middle, and that's where unit testing is probably going to help you a lot. But if the problem is really in the interaction between these different things, then you need a different kind of testing, and that's not going to help you necessarily.
I would also say that if you are a smaller company and you right now do not have the budget for a dedicated QA team or QA engineers, don't fret, because for large parts of my career, I worked for companies where there was not a dedicated QA team, right? And why it's great to have to aspire to actually having a dedicated QA team who are extremely well versed in automation and help your process. You can do a lot without that, right? I look at QA as a luxury, almost like something that's fantastic and almost as an insurance policy. But I would say primarily the quality starts with the engineering team. It lives with the engineering team, and it's that mindset, right? And you could do a lot with a good design process, good test coverage, and just having that mindset of delivering, right? I often say, if you were just a contractor and some client was just paying you millions of dollars to make sure this software will work really, really well without a QA team, like how would your mindset change to deliver this versus if you can just throw it over to the QA team and you're done. So
can I just double down on that, because we don't have a QA team. Like there you go. It goes back to the whole discipline thing. If it's just unit test is probably the easiest thing anybody can do. Just get it. It's part of this. It's part of what we do. It also is, in terms of documentation, this is how you're supposed to use this module. It's in a test, right? It's not self-documenting. So there's so many benefits of doing that, and you just get disciplined about it. It becomes easy. It doesn't become a huge burden, and you don't necessarily need a QA team if you've already established, the tooling around the testing is more important. So do you have the code coverage baked in? You don't have to think about it. It's there.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree 100% with
well, it's the same with Brian and I when we were at Clipped. There was not a dedicated QA team, and it was the same situation. The code quality was very high. The personal responsibility was very high. The test coverage and the aspiration to get greater test coverage was very high. So
awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it also comes down to some of the culture around teaching developers and growing them, making sure that they learn new things. So if they come in not knowing testing, okay, no problem. Like, let's teach you, let's get you up to speed, and having that kind of baked in. And I think that's one of those cultural aspects that I think we touched on earlier. Cool. So I think we've talked a lot about the tools and technology. I think we delved into specifically testing a little bit, and we kind of touched on a laundry list of different things, whether that's like telemetry or logging or various things. But if you guys had to kind of pick a specific thing, whether that's logging, metrics, testing, that's kind of the highest leverage among those things, like what is the order of operations in terms of what people should focus on first when they're kind of building up a software team and building this infrastructure? Trevor, you want to get started there?
Sure, I'll go first. I mean, for me, it's metrics. It's always
Okay.
metrics. Metrics are going to be the highest bang for your buck in terms of understanding how your production systems are actually performing. Obviously, everything else that you mentioned is also super important. But I think if I had to pick just one, in terms of actually understanding what's going on with my customers, I would probably start with metrics.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And when you're saying metrics, you're saying like performance metrics, or are we talking about something else?
It's a mix of performance and operational metrics. I think like understanding what the key systems are in your product and kind of what the key metrics for those are. Start with something like SLOs. So put those metrics in very customer facing terms. That can be a good tactic to find the right metrics. So you're not just like, kind of scattershot, like let's get the CPU and everything else. Like those might not be the right metrics to be looking at.
Right. Does anyone want to follow up there?
I would say metrics and logging. You could sort of bundle logging in with metrics in a way, I suppose. But I really think extensive logging. So I'd say metrics, logging, test coverage are sort of the first few things you should look at.
Focus on.
Curious about what Brian was about to say as well.
Yeah, Brian, want to take it from there?
I think I'm going to turn us 90 degrees and throw a curveball here. I think the most important thing when you get started is retrospection and iteration. I feel like, doing an experiment, retrospecting on that, and then iterating, that is the basis that will get you anywhere you need to go. And getting good at that process will allow all the other processes to flow freely.
Gotcha.
But your retros will be better if you have metrics.
Melissa, you want to finish this up there?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like getting the right, we just had a product session at Kensho about vanity metrics. So getting the right metrics for whatever it is that you're trying to validate, but making sure that you're measuring the right things, and that may or may not translate to technical metrics like CPU or whatnot. It depends on what it is, but getting the metrics for validating an idea or a product or a feature or whatever it is, getting those right, I think is key.
Nice. So we have a decent amount of consensus around metrics, which is good. Some actionable stuff for our audience. Okay, so at this point, I think I'm going to move to audience QA. So we have a question from Sal here. And so first, great conversation. I totally agree. This is like great stuff here. A lot of these engineering decisions have clear implications for the business. Can you discuss how to communicate your approach and decisions and getting buy-in from stakeholders and PMs? I think we briefly touched on this earlier. Melissa, you want to start us off there?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this earlier with respect to technical debt, right? Because again, if you're communicating in a very engineering mindset versus a holistic mindset, then you're gonna talk about technical debt as this fence and whatnot. So I think it's the same thing for product or driving forward change. You have to bridge that gap between the engineering decisions that you're trying to drive forward and what that means for an end user, right? And you need product for that. So it has to be a partnership with product to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to talk about things in terms of not in engineering speak, but in how do you translate that to something that makes sense for the business, for the outcome that you're both looking for, right? So you've got to work on that partnership to speak the same language.
Right. Like, where's that middle ground? Where can we like talk with each other and figure this out together?
Mm-hmm.
Brian, you want to hop in?
I mean, Melissa nailed it. I agree 100%. And I also want to say, hi, Sal. Good question.
That's right. Hi, Sal.
Oh yes, we never said hello to Sal. Thank you for the question. I would also second this. I mean, this buy-in situation would occur. I'm sort of guessing in one or two scenarios, right? Either you're just starting out and you have nothing right now, or you're in the middle of some problems that you're trying to solve, right? Some issues, whether they are whatever tech debt related, performance related, production bugs. So, like one way to get that buy-in, again, it goes back to that education and say, we can say with some level of certainty that putting these processes in place or putting more investment in these areas will alleviate these existing problems that we're having. And to be able to show that, that's a separate conversation entirely, right? Over how many sprints or weeks or months is progress or velocity dependable, but you can still start that conversation by saying, these are the concrete things that we feel like we can address. right? And this is how we want to address them. Let's give this a try. I think that's a good way to start to at least get buy-in.
Right. Yeah. Having that conversation, talking about the different pieces and trying to educate folks on the engineering side of things as well. Right. Cool. I think we can move on to our next question. So Hakeem has asked, as a new startup, what's most important in your engineering team protocol when building just your MVP, or can this be outsourced? Should we, this is kind of like a build versus buy question, or I guess it's like building your own team MVP. Are there tools you can leverage to maybe get something out quickly versus outsourcing?
So yes, you can certainly outsource that. It goes back to what hopes and aspirations do you have of your MVP product? Is this an MVP that is going to be, presented as a proof of concept to some investors, and then you get the funding to then, produce this in a more complete or thought through way, or does this become the code base for you to develop this product further? And what happens often is, like, these MVPs, they are developed under extreme pressure, and they do have often a specific function, but that's where it ends. While the desire is to then start from scratch, this prototype ends up becoming the foundation of your large product, right? So prototypes end up getting launched, and then you are already sort of shooting yourself in the foot. So I would say if we're going to be building on this, I would communicate those desires really well to whoever you're outsourcing it to, and just keep an eye on what the future looks like. On the other hand, if this is a throwaway, if it's a really extreme MVP, I would say it matters less.
I see. Okay, I think we have maybe one last question that I'll publish here. So what's the best time to launch the product? Shall we have a concrete go-to-market plan for launching? Since this is more of an engineering kind of talk, I think maybe we can reframe this as, when do you know that you can launch your particular feature or product and it's ready for customers to look at?
I would say if you're at the point that you're trying to validate go-to-market or product market fit as opposed to technical aspects of it, like, it's really impossible. Like, you need to put that in customers' hands in order to be able to validate that. So there's not a whole lot of technical reasons why you should necessarily wait, unless it's like a one-way door for some reason, which it's almost never that early on.
Right. So it's not necessarily speed versus quality kind of consideration. It's like, get that thing out there, test it out, try it out quickly, and make sure that you're on the right track before you invest a lot of time or effort.
Yeah, and then looking at that question under the lens of quality, it can also be helpful to maybe have a soft launch, maybe with some friendly customers, to be able to give you feedback directly, to really get a sense of how are people experiencing the product. That can be a useful tool to kind of gauge whether it's ready for the real public.
Right. We have the benefit of doing this at Kensho. We do this quite often actually with our solutions. So we have our friendlies at S&P that try out some solutions, and then we go to market with them. So it's really great. But I agree with Trevor. It's get it out there, test and validate the idea, and then you going back to square one isn't as painful as if you tried something and spent years before you get something out or months before you get something out. It's the wrong thing. So
I think getting totally agree with you guys. Getting something out really quickly, I think, also lets you get over the psychological hurdle of version 1.0 or beta is out. Otherwise, you sort of keep iterating, thinking it's not good enough, and then you may miss the window, or you just keep sort of procrastinating. I think it's good to really have discipline around, okay, this is good enough. And know that the purpose of this is for us to actually learn, because a lot of what we're doing right now may not be relevant. So let's actually get it out, sort of deliver that baby, and then start iterating on that based on feedback. You're gonna start making, I think, better decisions, better product decisions once you start getting some customers' eyes on it.
Right. Totally. That makes sense. Okay. Well, that was our last question. But this was such a fantastic conversation. Again, thank you guys so much for giving your time today. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else in the audience did as well. And even the panelists, I hope you guys learned something from your colleagues here as well. But yeah, so Startup Boston, we have a lot of really great panels coming up later today. So we have 3 more software panels today. So please check those out if you're interested on the software side of things. And then obviously for the rest of the week, we have a ton more stuff. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.
Thank you, Reed.
Thank you, Reed. Thank you,
Thanks so much,
everybody.
everyone.